Go ahead. Hawks, tell Armageddon. Tell them the law of desolation reaches for them. Tell them to fight hard.
Welcome back, Warpugs. I have a question for you. What does it take to become a legend of the Imperium? A hero. A hero of the Imperium. A legend is not born, they are made. Some achieve their greatness early and some do not. In the case of Sebastian Yarrick, his status was just that of a regular commissar for most of his now storied career. As much as natural talent, bravery, and dedication are a part of the mixture for a true hero, there is one last thing that remains. One last ingredient that can remove someone from the rank and file and make them legendary. When Commissar Yarrick stepped from the common rank and file and into Imperial legend, it was not because of any sudden flash of inspiration or ability, nor was it because he suddenly decided to display hidden traits and talents that he had kept secret. No, these aspects of his character had been present all along. They were present as he survived the death of the City of Three Rivers. They had been present when he had fought the heretics and the demons of Mythos. The very things that made Yarrick the hero of Armageddon had existed throughout a career past Mythos that spanned over 150 years. It was in the very core of his being. It was in the very blood in his veins. And it's why I said that perseverance was the core trait that defined him. The last element that was needed was not opportunity, because Yarrick had many. Yarrick had remained the same rank he had been when he first put on his commissarial sash. While Seraph had politically maneuvered himself into the rank of Lord Commissar, Yarrick did not politically maneuver, and the friends he had made were there because they respected him. It wasn't favoritism, because quite literally Yarrick was hated by most of those in Armageddon that outranked him. Not opportunity. Not favoritism. No. The final ingredient to make an Imperial hero is necessity. Armageddon had more than enough favoritism. It had more than enough bravery and strength, and it had more than enough opportunity. Armageddon had steel and will, power and prestige, but it lacked one thing. Armageddon needed a leader. Armageddon needed a hero.
Don't ask me why I followed him. That's just stupid. You've never seen him. You don't know what it's like to be around him. I'd run after him into anything. Anything. And he'd do the same for us. Hell, he'd probably do more than that.
The next time we see the good Commissar is over a century and a half later, arriving back to Armageddon after a battle in the world of Besquit, which of course the good Commissar won. The Commissar was troubled though, because typically while orcs are orcs, these orcs were acting unorky. They also kept repeating something that Yarrick knew to be a name. Gazgul. After arriving back home through a warp storm that was so bad it was literally choking off all communications, he went to report his superiors, one of which now being Lord Commissar Sheriff, who has a hate boner now for Yarrick the size of a half-spire, and none other than the planetary governor of Armageddon, Herman von Straub. Now I've covered the Overlord before, of course in my typical, non-biased way.
Flashback.
Jabba the fuck,
Bruh.
Overseer Obesity,
Bruh.
Pay attention, fat ass,
Bruh.
Major Morbidity,
Bruh.
Lord Commander Fatwa,
Bruh, bruh, bruh.
good going, fat ass.
End of flashback.
But this is the first instance where we really get to see the Overlord shine. The Hog Beast ignored literally everything said to him about the orcs on Besquit. Apparently he had better things to do than listen to an expert on the orcs tell him something was wrong with the state of affairs disclosed to Terra. In fact, von Straub, in his first meeting with Yarrick, almost got shot by Yarrick and knew the Commissar was considering it. Why didn't he? Straub was smiling though, because if life is a buffet, then the only check he wasn't getting was the reality one. Planet Governor Glutton attempted to forcefully retire Yarrick, posting him to Hades Hive to oversee recruitment, which is a job for wounded commissars who are recovering from the field. It was an insult, and it was taken as one. In fact, Yarrick wasn't the only one that von Straub wasn't listening to. Kurtz Mannheim, leader of Legio Metallica, his chief astropath, the admiral of his defense fleet, All of them were telling Hungry Herman to put down the damn plate and pick up a data slate, but the Hamburglar-in-Chief had spent the better part of his reign literally surrounding himself with two types of people. From the top down, if he ever doubted himself, he had a cadre of yes-men or simple cowards who would never challenge him or stand up to him, because if they did, the great god of Armageddon would add another name to the list of people to be murdered. Yarrick himself at that point didn't rank high enough on Mayor McCheese's list of importance to have an accident involving 23 bolt shells to the back of the head. So for that point, exile was good enough for Yarrick. Warnings from the astral chartist had been coming in for months. The astropaths kept having premonitions of doom. Literally any signal or sign you could possibly think of was being shown as obviously as possible. But nothing, and I mean nothing, pierced the layer upon layer of blubber encrusting the neurons of Fuhrer fat rolls, and anyone else who had heard these warnings and tried to act on them was finding themselves either demoted to non-relevance or outright demoted from alive to dead. Nothing was done. No stockpiling. No plans. Nothing. Seriously though, even at some point Ray Charles could have seen the writing on the wall. Even the God Emperor himself tried to warn von Straub to get his act together when a statue of the Emperor in Hell's Reach started crying blood the day before things went down. When a statue of the Emperor starts crying tears of blood, it should be time to put the fork down and take things seriously. But no! Aside from Yarrick, Herman von Stroganoff had been warned by enough people that at some point it should have caused some doubt. But sure enough, the Great Greasy One dismissed everything, including a visitor to the planet who just wanted to say hey to Yarrick, Canoness Sethano. Remember her? Huge woman, power armor, stared into the future? Yeah, her. Not even her, who literally shamed career criminals into fervent compliance by staring at them hard, managed to pierce the blubber-coated logic of the overgut of Armageddon. Mannheim, on the other hand, was opening to hearing about the horrors, and so was Admiral Isakov, the leader of the Armageddon Defense Fleet. Mannheim tried to have the astropathic choir send out a warning, but nothing could be sent out through the warp storm, so Mannheim did the next best thing. Mannheim asked Isakov to take his fleet to the Mandeville Point just to make sure something absolutely horrible wasn't coming into the system, and sure enough, right when Mannheim, Yarrick, and Sethano were gathered by a Voxhaler, something horrible came into the system. Just to make it clear how horrible this thing was, a defense fleet consisting of a battleship, cruisers, and multiple escorts barely had time to register what came out of the warp before they just upped and accepted they were going to die in less than a minute. Less than 60 seconds after Space Hulk Alvis Alpha Alpha Sextus was registered by the battleship Reach of Judgment, the entire fleet was dead. Not from weapons fire, but not being able to maneuver out of the way of the Hulk in time to avoid becoming a part of it. The Space Hulk was so large that an entire Imperial battle group, as spread out as it was, got ran by it seconds after it exited the warp. When the battleship blew up, it didn't even shave off the top layer of the Space Hulk. Okay now guys, Yarrick will definitely have the Overlord's attention, right? Right?
You serious?
No mobilizations were given. No mobilizations were allowed. In fact, Yarrick probably lost most of the rest of his hair at this time because nothing was being done at all. What was clear to everyone in short order was the following. The Space Hulk was going to hit the planet. None of the regiments were being mobilized, and the list of people who actually knew what was going on were willing and able to do something about it was so short that you could probably count it on one hand and have a middle finger left to flip off the Space Hulk when it entered the atmosphere, which it did, and promptly vaporized the small hive of Ulfrin. The militia of Tempestora, who had been told to, and I quote, expect hostile landings, had a good chunk of their forces standing on the wall of the hive when the shockwave from the impact hit. Citizens in Tempestora were given a whole new meaning to the song It's Raining Men, because anyone who didn't duck down before it hit were thrown hundreds of meters in the air. Entire hab blocks collapsed into rubble, and Tempestora was covered in a dust cloud as a decent portion of the skyline was blasted into new configurations or leveled completely. It was then in Hive and Furnace that a fork touched a table, and Herman von Straub issued his first order. First, he deployed the 552nd Regiment of the Armageddon Steel Legion, which was Yarrick's command to Tempestora. Then he recalled all the regiments of the Steel Legion to hives closer to his own location in Hive and Furnace. Finally, he sent the entire militia of Hive Tempestora into the field, unsupported, to investigate the rather large new addition to the topography of Armageddon. For those of you unfamiliar with the planet Armageddon, here's the primer. It's said that there are two continents of Armageddon named Prime and Secundus, but really there is just one. If you think it's silly that everyone says there are two continents when there are just one, remember that we always say the Emperor had 20 sons when really he had 21. What separates the continents is a massive jungle, and that's about it. The Hulk had come down on Prime, and guess what else was on Prime? What used to be Hive Ulfrin, Hive Tempestora, Hive Volcanus, and Hive Deathmire, as well as a few smaller hives. So let's summarize. Yarrick is currently flying with a group of his regiment toward Hive Tempestora, a hive that, thanks to von Straub, now has defenders which number somewhere in the range of between 0 and 0. Any regiments of Steel Legion that were located on Prime were now leaving the only credible fighting force on the entire continent as Yarrick's own 252nd. Joy! Oh, and by the way, just in case you were harboring some kind of illusion that the militia from Tempestora did something other than get immediately surrounded and exterminated. Stupid! You're so stupid! Let me just completely disabuse you of that. The Tempestora militia was wiped out to the last man and woman within minutes and barely even registered as a speed bump. While he was flying closer to Tempestora, Yarrick's flying convoy became a beautiful target for the massive orc horde, and most of the regiment that had came with him wound up getting shot down. Yarrick and Sethano had to make it to Tempestora on foot, all the while fighting off encirclement by speed freaks. When they arrived in the city, there was quite literally not a damn thing to do. The population of people who were actually militaristically inclined in the city had increased from 0 to around 500, but against what was coming, that was going to amount to approximately dick. You want to know how bad the situation was in Tempestora? A canoness of the Sisters of Battle and a commissar were the first ones to flat out say the hive was lost before a single shot was fired. That's how bad it was. A literal tide of orcs was coming, and something alarming was happening. Yarrick saw, almost immediately, that not all the orcs were coming to engage the city. The leader was holding forces back.
What? Bro, what are you talking about, man?
The revelation of this rocked literally everyone who had ever fought the orcs to their core, including Yarrick, because this is something the orcs just don't do. There are no words for strategic reserve in Orcish. Hell, there isn't even a word for patience. Yarrick already knew the orc leader's name, Gazgul, because he had heard it over and over on Beskett, and now he was hearing it chanted from the ash wastes of Armageddon. Yarrick decided that even though Tempestora might be an outright lost cause, there might be something that could be done. The good commissar had studied the hives of the planet he had lived on for years, and knew that Tempestora had one thing in abundance: Promethium. I'm gonna give you a list of characters in 40k who have ever turned an entire hive city into a firebomb. This guy! Yarrick gave the order to empty the city's water supply and give it a new liquid, and shot the only man in the city who told him no. The governor of Tempestora actually shocked Yarrick by actually giving a crap enough about his people enough to sound an evacuation, and millions fled the city in an abject panic trying to escape. Now, before you judge Yarrick too harshly, remember this: there was nothing, and I mean nothing, he could do at this point other than take a situation that was horrific and do something with it. The Imperial citizens were dead in either case. When the orcs breached the walls, they set about instantly slaughtering anyone who remained, but by that time the water piping and streets were flooded with flamer fuel, and it was just waiting for a match. As Yarrick and what was left of his regiment played GTA 5 and stealing some chimeras from a local manufactorum, Tempestora erupted like a volcano, and in Hive Infernus, Hermann von Straub smelled something in the wind and promptly ordered fried mushrooms because he had a hankering all of a sudden. As Yarrick was riding away from the literal hell he had made of Tempestora, he was trying to come to terms with something he had heard the orcs saying about their leader Gazgul. They were calling him a prophet. Not a war boss, not any other title that commonly got associated with a huge green mass of muscles. They were calling him the Prophet. I can already hear one of my subscribers squealing in delight as well as existential crisis. Tempestora was completely destroyed. No one survived, and as the chimeras made their way to Volcanus, they spotted an orc battle wagon parked directly in their path. Now, there's a few things I can expect from orcs, and Yarrick expects a lot too, but the orcs have been sent there simply to laugh at them. The orcs were rewarded for their message with multiple heavy bolter rounds, but the message had been delivered. Gazgul had saw what they had done, and he had found it amusing. As far as the civilians who evacuated Tempestora and the ones who stayed, well, I'll say this: the yearly census of the Hive dropped from 9 digits to 0. While Yarrick was riding towards Hive Volcanus, he got filled in on the situation at the Hive, and it made him a bit happier, but not by much. Volcanus made weapons, a lot of them, and they were currently being handed out to every civilian that was old enough to hold one and young enough to point one downrange. Kurtz Mannheim of the Legio Metallica, upon hearing about what was happening, tried once again to get the great girthy one to allow him to deploy the entire Legio in defense of Volcanus, but von Straub simply wasn't having it. Even though there was a monstrous amount of armed civilians and a good portion of militia was at the Hive, the canoness of the Sisters of Battle, Sethano, flat out stated once again the Hive would fall in a day or less. That is how desperate the situation was. Let me talk to you about hives. Hives are brutally effective defensive structures, and by brutally effective, I mean it's downright silly to actually attack one. Even defended by a few regiments of regular soldiers, an adequate at best PDF force, and supplemented by a small militia, a hive that is reasonably equipped can take a ridiculously hilarious toll on the attackers, to the point where attacking a hive is almost suicidal to most invaders. Given that previous statement, it should just go to show you how bad the situation was on Armageddon Prime. There was only one regiment defending the entirety of the continent. The militia was not sufficiently trained. The situation was so bad that Volcanus was literally arming civilians with military hardware. This is past the point of god-awful, and Volcanus' governor and commander were literally flinging everything they could at the wall in hopes something would stick. The only good thing is that the remainder of the 252nd had deployed with its full complement of tanks and basilisks, so that counted for something. Yarrick's force had kept pace with the orcs as they moved toward Volcanus, and when the orcs attacked, Yarrick brought his own forces to catch the orcs in a pincer maneuver, and what do you know? Everything was going well! Until the orcs caught them in a pincer maneuver. Literally everyone was slack-jawed as yet again the orc leader had managed to outsmart every Imperial commander, and it was all anyone could do to get them back inside the walls of Volcanus before the orcs snapped shut the jaws of the pincer and completely overwhelmed the defenders outside the wall. Once again, Mannheim asked to deploy to Volcanus, and again, Straub told him no. Yarrick himself flatly refused to abandon the Hive. He was already seething from what had happened at Tempest Story and couldn't stomach the thought of it happening again. Yarrick was on the verge of losing it Commissar style, because every single time he looked around, all he saw was neglect, incompetence, and flat-out stupidity from the high-ranking members of the Imperium, making the Imperium itself suffer, and it wasn't about to get any better. The 252nd, alongside the civilians and militia, were the first to find out that the orcs now had gargants. Again, the Imperial commanders watched in shock because the orcs were not just rushing forward and dying. They were literally doing an orc impression of an Iron Warrior-style siege, advancing, clearing trenches, smoothing land for vehicles, and erecting shields to march behind. In the end, there were just too many orcs, not enough wall guns firing, and not nearly enough of everything else. The Imperial commander of Hive Volcanus could only provide stopgap measures until the orcs did something completely un-orky, using literal tractor beams to yank the doors completely off their hinges, while the orc versions of jump troopers took to the skies. The level of coordination and cooperation between various tribes of the orcs that would usually be at each other's throats, as well as the sheer tactics they were using, took the Imperials, Yarrick included, completely by surprise, with several exclaiming that they couldn't believe the orcs were doing this. Hermann von Straub couldn't believe it's not butter. Canoness Sethano, on the other hand, decided that if Yarrick didn't want to leave just yet, she might as well make the orcs pay just a bit more.
Woke up feeling cute today. Think I might just solo kill one of these stompas. Boss bitch reporting in.
She decided she had never really seen the inside of an orc stomper before, so she went to have herself a look. Running straight at it, she got herself inside the command deck by literally Legolasing the hell out of it. Imagine, if you will, being an orc piloting a Gargant when a platinum blonde in power armor shows up. She's absolutely not there to sing you happy birthday, Mr. President. I don't think I really need to go over what happens when a Sister of Battle steps into a temple that worships a god that isn't Big E. I think you get the picture. After literally soloing an orc stompa, she went and hopped into a boat and set sail for a little place called Nemesis, which is a penal colony. Now when confronted with a canoness who just soloed the orc equivalent of a knight who demands you do what she say, you have one of two options. Say, of course, and do as you're told. Or B, I hope you like spicy food because you're about to eat any words that fly out of your mouth. Sethano was too much of a boss to even contemplate. She got up in front of the worst of Armageddon. Mass murderers, torturers, gingers, you know, the really truly damned of society, and within 2 seconds she had shamed the entire penal colony into grabbing whatever was close to hand to go kill some orcs in the name of the Emperor. Sethano was just built different, guys. Even with the entire prison population added to the numbers at Volcanus, the hive was simply being overwhelmed. Even Yarrick, as much as he didn't want to admit it, knew that staying was just simply suicide. Volcanus kept falling, even with the literal horde of all civilians. Well, to be honest, the civilians were dying like flies. The civilians were dying in numbers that would make Krieg's guardsmen pass out from sheer ecstasy. In the end, Yarrick knew Sethano was right. Volcanus, even with the added weight of the prisoners from Nemesis, was falling in record time. Yarrick swallowed his rage and boarded a Chimera, and Mannheim arranged for Yarrick to be transported to Infernus on board a Valkyrie. Coming with Yarrick was Sethano and the commander of the 252, which as at that point no longer really existed as a combat unit, with the entire regiment wiped out to the last guardsman. Yarrick, as of this moment, was completely done. Looking out the window, he saw Hive Deathmire was already burning. Volcanus was gone. Tempestor was a smoking ruin, and all within the span of 72 hours of the orcs making planetfall. That's 3 hives, unknown numbers of smaller hives, all wiped out. Yarrick, up until this point, had only acted within the confines of his office, hoping that reason would prevail over the unreasonable. He had not taken any great steps outside or tested the limits of his authority. It had become abundantly clear to him that if the planet was going to be saved, drastic action was needed. And for a start, the Imperium actually had to know what was going on the planet. Armageddon had not been able to get a message out since before the invasion due to the warp storm in the area. Yarrick needed to get that call out. Armageddon needed the Astartes, and Armageddon needed reinforcements. When he arrived at Infernus, Mannheim and the commander of the 252 went to distract Hermann von Straub, knowing that the porker-in-chief would want to hear all about exactly what had happened and promptly laid blame at everyone else's feet for the piss-poor decisions he himself had made, which is exactly what happened. Right up until the point where apparently the last bonbon General Girthy had eaten settled, and he realized that if the commander of the 252 was there, then Yarrick must be somewhere. Yarrick, on the other hand, had went to the Astropathic Choir and asked the leader there to do the impossible. Taking one look at the Commissar and seeing in his mind what Yarrick had seen, the choir leader took the message and swore to do his best. With Yarrick standing guard with 2 members of the choir guard, members of the choir were dying left and right, trying to force their way through the storm by sheer will alone, taking psychosomatic backlash after backlash. Outside, Hermann von Straub's guards came to make sure that Yarrick wasn't being such a bad little commissar, and found out that indeed he was. Yarrick and the choir guard fought against the personal guard of Hermann von Straub, which went just about as well as you'd expect with a grizzled commissar up against men who were used to shoving nobles out of the way at a buffet line. Finally, von Straub himself arrived, and once again Yarrick was faced with the decision to kill von Straub. And again he stayed his hand, even as von Straub grabbed the door handle to the choir hall. A psychic backlash erupted just as he opened the door, and everyone rushed in to find the choir hall in ruins. The choir primus took one look at Yarrick, wounds erupting all over his body, and said his final words, "It is done." Yarrick was satisfied. Von Straub was pissed. After all, the one and only great greased pig of Armageddon had this well under control and didn't need outside help. Von Straub instantly exiled him to Hades. Hades was not like Tempestor with a thriving Prometheum export business. It wasn't like Volcanus with its weapon manufactura. Hades was a hive that had been in decline for centuries, its mineral extraction industry having long since put itself nearly out of business. In short, Hades was poor, dirty, and used up. Upon arrival at Hades, he was greeted by Sergeant Lanner, who upon meeting the Commissar said this.
"Heard some good stories. Heard you don't put up with what that fat turd keeps shoveling our way."
Now, it was instantly clear to anybody that was paying attention and had more than 2 neurons firing in their skull who exactly Lanner was talking about. Typically, saying something like this to a commissar would normally get a free cranium reconfiguration via a bolt shell, but Yarrick could only suppress a grin. Good old Sarge! Sarge Lanner then took him to see Colonel Helm. Helm told him that he had been ordered to assign Yarrick to a frontline company commander as a political officer, a company that would get thrown at the orcs at the earliest available opportunity. Helm also told him these orders were trash, and he wasn't going to do it because the orders were stupid. Once again, that is another thing that could get you shot by a commissar. Hades might not have massive weapons industries, it might not have a Prometheum industry. At that point, you could be hard-pressed to find any sort of industry that could call Hades home, but Hades had one thing in abundance.
You have balls. I like balls.
It had balls the size of battleships, and Yarrick could only approve of this. What was also clear was that a lot of commanders planet-wide could see the writing on the wall, and that Yarrick had begun to develop a reputation as a man who was at least trying to stop the tide. Word had gotten out. Helm was actually deferring to him, and Yarrick barely took note of it because he was already making plans. Yarrick declared Hades would be a weapon. In the meantime, by his very actions, the men that were around him were beginning to take notice, and not only beginning to take notice, they were beginning to follow him. Not because his rank authorized him to lead in these circumstances. It wasn't because it was asked of them, nor was it because he demanded of them. In their eyes, he was worthy of it, worthy of their loyalty and respect, and worthy to lead. Yarrick's introduction to the hive's governor, named Trenton, went really poorly for the governor. Yarrick hated him upon seeing him, as while the Steel Legion and civilians outside were looking for leadership, there was none coming from up top. Yarrick told the governor to start leading, and when the governor grew his spine and asked who Yarrick thought he was trying to command him, Yarrick asked the governor what made the governor think that he could ignore Yarrick. Yarrick was done with the stupidity. He was done with the lack of a spine. He was done with the inane decisions that had lost an entire continent to an invader in 3 days. Most of all, he was done with the legion of sycophants and toadies that surrounded von Straub and permeated every office on the planet. It was a cancer, a rot. It was a blight on the Imperium that was currently causing the loss of a planet so close to terror it was sickening, and something had to change, because if it didn't, the planet was gone, and the Imperium would be shaken to its core at a time where it could not afford it. Yarrick began issuing orders, bolstering the defense regardless of Trenton's indecision. In a short time, the orcs entered the equatorial jungle that separated Prime from Secundus. In Hive and Furnace, Overlord Obesity found out that the orcs were coming. He had been adamant that the orcs would not do this, and he was so sure of it he literally shut down any discussion of what would happen if they did. Well, they were coming, and they were loving the trip to the jungle, apparently. Now, it might seem like I hate the Overlord of Armageddon, and I do, because once he found out the orcs were coming into the jungle, he turned to Mannheim, and he issued an order that Mannheim had no choice but to follow or betray everything the Princeps of the Legio Metallica had ever stood for. Mannheim was ordered to take his entire Legio unsupported into the field. An Imperator, 3 Reavers, 8 Warlords, and a dozen Warhounds unsupported against a tide of orcs that had ripped through an entire continent in 3 days. Don't get me wrong, this level of firepower is past the point of ludicrous, but a major vulnerability of Titans, even the massive Emperor-class Titans, is that they can and will be boarded. They can be overwhelmed by a mass of smaller engines. Also, don't get me wrong, the force that it would take to overwhelm a single Warlord-class Titan is absolutely absurd, much less an entire Legio with the numbers on the screen right now. The problem is, everyone knew that not only did the orcs have that at this point, everyone knew for the orcs, those kinds of numbers on Armageddon were a drop in the bucket. Ask any general worth $2 and an unwrapped Mentos in the Imperium, and they would never allow a Titan group to go out alone without any support, asked for or not. The risk to Imperial assets is too great. But again, there were no orders to deploy, and this primarily is because the general of the Armageddon Steel Legion, who I have not even talked about yet because he's so far up the Overlord's butt crack that we can only see his feet sticking out, this is the guy that refused to do anything to contradict von Straub. And speaking of our fearless fat ass, von Straub decided it was time to relocate his command center from Infernus to Tartarus, and left instructions that the governor of Infernus was to negotiate with the orcs if he saw fit. General Adnek, the general of the Steel Legion that was planetside, got a couple of visitors in his office a bit later. In particular, a rather large canoness, the colonel of the 252nd, 2 tank commanders, as well as a guy holding a Voxhaler. They confronted Adnek about not deploying to support the Legio Metallica, which was already on its way to intercept the orcs. When the general once again failed to do his damn job, Yarrick's voice came from the Voxhaler. The instructions were simple. The general would deploy or else. The general chose else, and Yarrick chose homicide. Yarrick, from his place in Hades, declared the overall general of the Steel Legion had committed desertion in the face of his duties and ordered him shot. A single last pistol report rang out from the commander of the 252nd. Hours later, 2 regiments of armored Steel Legion were on the verge of catching up with the Legio Metallica, which was already suffering losses in the face of the orcs. The Legio was surrounded, and even at full combat line formation for Titans, they had been completely engulfed. Just as the armored regiments tried to punch through the orcs to reinforce the Legio, the orcs sprang yet another trap. Both of the regiments, as well as the Legio, were cut off, surrounded, and exterminated to the last engine and the last man. Mannheim went out like a legend, piloting his Titan Steelhammer directly into melee range with the largest Gargant on the field, and he detonated his fusion core. Mannheim eradicated an estimated 6 million orcs. But that 6 million orcs had come at the cost of an entire Legio. This did not go over well with Yarrick. Then another product of von Straub's masterful command of the situation developed. Canoness Sethana was walking through Hive and Furnace and listening to a address on the Vox, an address that didn't seem quite right. She saw a militiaman standing around, which again, didn't seem quite right. When she asked him what was going on and why he wasn't doing anything, she was told that he had been given orders to stand down. This is a problem. Infernus is the first hive the orcs would run into after finishing the Legio Metallica. The tumblers started clicking into place. Sethano did some mental math, took the situation, deleted balls and bitchmade, and realized what was happening. She promptly solo-stormed the governor's high spire and found him delivering the Vox address with a few orcs lounging around him making fun of him.
Sisterofbattle.exe initialized. Running program. Cross-referencing data. Xeno swine detected. Traitor detected. Would you like assistance in your act of wanton destruction, Canoness?
She murdered the orcs in short order and stalked down the governor whose shrieks were being broadcast citywide, and she beheaded him on the dais where he was making his speech from. And then, in the silence of the antechamber, she heard the doors of Infernus opening, welcoming the orcs to the city. Yarrick was informed. Yarrick's head whipped toward the general location in the hive where he could find Hades' hive governor. He found Triton praying in a chapel and asked him what his intentions were. And the stupid bastard actually, in some sort of fever dream, thought that Yarrick would not only be okay with, but fully support his actions in surrendering Hades wholesale to the orcs as well. In fact, the governor already planned on doing it. Well, Yarrick let him know he thought it was a swell idea, and they should go tell the masses. Yarrick led him outside, and as soon as Yarrick grabbed a Voxcaster and put it in front of the hive governor in front of millions of people, all of the governor's house guard realized things were about to go down. Triton gleefully told the entire city that he was going to surrender the hive. Yarrick shot him. Then he grabbed the mic and spat some bars. The entire hive was whipped into a frenzy, ready to fight the invader with anything they could get their hands on. Sarge Lanner even took Yarrick to meet with the Underhiver gangs, who signed on with Yarrick only after about, 3 executions, and let me tell you, that's a record. Within a day, the orcs were at the edge of the hive, and the siege was about to begin, the first true battle of the war, where a hive was actually somewhat prepared and staffed, armed and waiting, ready to respond to threats and fight. Hell's Reach, a bit further away, was in the same situation, ready to go, ready to fight, and ready to follow the Commissar. The true war of Armageddon was about to begin.
And mention that fat fool doing something completely stupid in at least 3 minutes. He's about to talk about Herman von Straub again, isn't he?
Right you are! You see, at the end of the day, the great girthy one was sitting in Tartarus and eating dinner when he got a data slate passed to him. Von Straub always thought he had an ace in the hole, and despite every engine seer who was working on this ace in the hole telling him it wasn't ready, he used it anyway. The great greasy one put down the fort for just long enough to reach over and press a button. Launch! You see, the Ham Planet knew that Tartarus had a massive supply of missiles. Missiles that were put there because of the first War of Armageddon. What was in those missiles, you ask? Well, the Life Eater virus. figures that the fat bastard's master plan would have had the word eater in it. Just like his state of physical fitness, the missiles had been not taken care of in quite some time. But even with the poor maintenance, a lot of the missiles still fired. They arched into the sky, heading to Vulcanus, Infernus, Hades, Hell's Reach, and Deathmire. Now, give me a minute because I can't really say this enough. These are not weapons you deploy on a whim or as any kind of tactical plan. These are weapons you deploy if you simply have no other choice than to literally murder the planet to stop whatever's happening there. Deploying weapons like this on a planet you currently live on is so far past suicide it boggles the mind. And the only reason this salad dodger survived is mainly due to the fact he had been so negligent in his duties that the missiles and their payloads had degraded so severely. Yarrick actually saw, from a slit in a hidden bunker, the missiles were coming, and although he didn't know what they were, he knew well enough to know to get hidden and sound the alarm. When the missiles struck, the casualties were absolutely stunning, with the orcs taking the brunt of the losses, but Hades had the advantage of being mostly insulated. In Hive Infernus, the casualties were beyond catastrophic. In Vulcanus, the cricket population dropped to 0, but the place that got the worst of it was Hell's Reach. Hive Hell's Reach's entire eastern defensive wall was simply wiped out, having nothing left to protect the defenders, not to mention it was the first Hive hit. But you see, it's not just the fact that the Life Eater was literally dissolving people and orcs instantaneously, it was the fact they released a massive flammable gas, which would then erupt, and then all the hives were bathed in an absolute firestorm. Von Straub, in one move, had sundered the planet's defenders and had only failed to kill the entire population of the planet by sheer neglect on his own part. In Hell's Reach, the survivors and the defenders of Von Straub's folly could only watch helplessly as Gargants approached a wall where no gun stood firing to oppose them and knocked the walls down. The orcs then swarmed the city. Yarrick went back to his position, cursing the fat overlord of Armageddon, and as the orcs pushed forward towards Hades again, he enacted his plan. He lunged out of his position, right into the middle of the orc Gargant formation and began shouting, making sure the orcs saw him even as he ordered the destruction of the bridge the Gargants were crossing. He then charged the line of orcs, who saw 3 symbols of their god suddenly and quite comprehensively destroyed, seemingly by the anger and rage of this old man. Yarrick and the gangers engaged the orcs, who suddenly were extremely afraid, who then turned and ran. Yarrick, though, was starting to experience ghost pains in his arm. The orcs had been chanting a name, Ugelhard. For some reason, every time Yarrick heard this name, his right arm would flare up, something he had often said was an old injury to pacify any concerns when he'd grab it in front of his guardsmen. As the orcs retreated, Yarrick was welcomed with jubilation into Hive Hades, with millions chanting his name, and Colonel Helm actually encouraged and enhanced the cult of personality that Yarrick had unintentionally began building. He made sure that anytime Yarrick would speak, Voxcaster would pump his words to the entire Hive, and Yarrick allowed him to do it. Yarrick, by executing Triton, had assumed command and now was the de facto leader of Hades' Hive, and he took to it as hard as he could. Finally, after a few days of battle, it all came to a head. After fighting a battle in the Underhive, Yarrick was contacted by Helm. In the background, Yarrick could hear the sounds of battle, but he also heard something else. Hades' Hive was chanting his name, and so were the orcs. The orcs were calling Yarrick to fight.